At 7:25 in the evening of May 6, 1937, 107 million Americans were going about their Tuesday night. Some were sitting down to dinner. Some were listening to the radio. Some were putting children to bed. None of them had any idea that in a field in Lakehurst, New Jersey, a radio reporter named Herbert Morrison was watching the largest flying machine ever built drift slowly toward its mooring mast. And that within 32 seconds, every person on Earth would know his name. The Hindenburg was 804 feet long, longer than the Titanic, 3 times the length of a modern Boeing 747. It carried 36 passengers and 61 crew members, and it contained 7 million cubic feet of hydrogen gas, the most flammable substance that had ever been used to keep human beings in the air. It had crossed the Atlantic 10 times without incident. Its passengers had dined on lobster, drunk German wine from crystal glasses, and slept in private cabins while traveling at 68 miles per hour above the ocean. It was, by any measure, the greatest achievement in the history of aviation. It burned to the ground in 32 seconds. And the most extraordinary thing about that fire, the thing that almost nobody talks about, is that every single person who built the Hindenburg, every engineer, every executive, every government official on both sides of the Atlantic, knew exactly what would happen if hydrogen ignited at altitude. They knew. They had a safer alternative. And a chain of decisions stretching across 15 years, from a government office in Washington to a budget meeting in Friedrichshafen, to the cockpit of the airship itself on a stormy evening in New Jersey, made sure that the alternative was never used. Here is a question worth sitting with. If you built something that you knew was dangerous, not suspected, not worried about, but genuinely knew carried a serious risk of catastrophic failure, and you launched it anyway, because stopping it was too expensive, too politically complicated, or too embarrassing, what would you call that? In 1937, they called it commercial aviation, and 36 people died for it on a Tuesday evening while a radio reporter wept into his microphone, and the whole world listened. This is the story of how the Hindenburg was built to be safe, redesigned to be dangerous, dressed up in Nazi swastikas, and sent across the Atlantic with passengers on board while the people who knew the truth kept it to themselves. To understand how the Hindenburg was possible, you have to understand one man. Hugo Eckener was 69 years old on the evening the Hindenburg burned. He was a former journalist, a trained meteorologist, and the most experienced airship commander in the world. He had taken over the Zeppelin Company after the death of its founder, Count Ferdinand von Zeppelin, in 1917, and had spent the following 2 decades turning the rigid airship into a genuine commercial enterprise. He was cautious, methodical, and obsessively safety conscious. The kind of man who had crossed the Atlantic dozens of times by air, and who understood, better than anyone alive, exactly what 7 million cubic feet of hydrogen gas meant if something went wrong. He also knew, from very early in the Hindenburg's development, that hydrogen was not the right gas to put inside it. The alternative was helium, a non-flammable noble gas that provided almost the same lifting power as hydrogen and burned nothing, under any circumstances, at any temperature. The British airship R-101 had crashed in France in 1930 burning hydrogen, killing 48 people, and Eckener had watched that disaster closely. He made a decision. The Hindenburg would be designed and built for helium. The gas cells were shaped for it. The ballast calculations were run for it. The entire engineering premise of the ship was helium. There was one problem. The only commercial source of helium in the world was the United States, and the United States had passed the Helium Control Act of 1927, which prohibited the export of helium to any foreign power. The law had been passed not because of any hostility toward Germany. The Nazis were not yet in power, and there was no specific threat, but simply because helium was scarce, expensive, and the American military wanted to keep all of it for its own airship program. The world's safest lifting gas was sitting in the ground in Texas, and no foreign aircraft company could touch it. Eckener did not accept this. In 1929, He traveled to Washington personally and made the case to American officials that helium would be used strictly for civilian passenger service. Remarkably, he succeeded. The U.S. government gave preliminary authorization for helium export to Germany for the Hindenburg Project. Eckener went home to Friedrichshafen believing the problem was solved. Then he opened the budget. Helium in 1937 cost 6 to 10 times more than hydrogen. The Hindenburg would need enormous storage and handling infrastructure that Germany did not have. And by this point, the organization funding the project was no longer a private company with its own money. It was the government of the Third Reich. The Nazis were willing to pay for the Hindenburg, but they were only willing to pay for it their way. And what that meant for the ship, and for everyone who would ever board it, would only become clear when the swastikas went up on the tail fins. By the time the Hindenburg made its first flight in March of 1936, it belonged to the Nazi regime in everything but name. The Deutsche Zeppelin Reederei, the company that operated it, had been quietly absorbed into the state apparatus. The Reich Air Ministry, headed by Hermann Göring, held authority over every operational decision, and Joseph Goebbels, the propaganda minister, had made his intentions for the airship absolutely clear from the beginning. Goebbels wanted the Hindenburg named after Adolf Hitler. Eckener refused. He named the ship after Paul von Hindenburg, the late German president, a man the Nazis had used to come to power and whom they now found it politically inconvenient to insult by refusing the honor. It was a small act of defiance, and it was essentially the last one Eckener was permitted. What followed was the systematic conversion of the world's greatest passenger airship into a flying billboard for National Socialism. The Hindenburg's maiden flight over Germany was not a commercial voyage. It was a propaganda operation, conducted jointly with the Graf Zeppelin, dropping thousands of pro-Nazi leaflets over major German cities ahead of a national referendum. The ship flew over Berlin at the opening ceremony of the 1936 Olympic Games. It appeared at the Nuremberg Rally. Its tail fins carried swastikas visible from the ground, and its radio transmitter broadcast Nazi programming on transatlantic crossings. The most advanced civilian aircraft in human history had become a swastika that could cross the ocean. Throughout all of this, Eckener had continued to argue internally for helium. He understood that hydrogen was not just a risk. It was a certainty waiting for the right conditions. Every crossing of the Atlantic was, in his private view, a crossing of borrowed time. But the Nazi economy was not interested in the additional cost of helium. And more importantly, the Nazi government had no interest in going back to the United States to ask for it. National pride, political posturing, and a budget that prioritized spectacle over safety had made the decision for him. The Hindenburg would fly on hydrogen. It would carry passengers through a smoking room, pressurized, it was said, to prevent any flammable gas from getting in, while 7 million cubic feet of hydrogen moved silently above their heads in gas cells made from the intestines of 250,000 cows. Eckener had a phrase he used in private with people he trusted. He called the Hindenburg a flying gas tank. He never said it publicly. The marketing campaign he had approved described the ship as the safest way to cross the Atlantic. It had now completed 62 flights without a serious incident. One more was scheduled to depart Frankfurt on the evening of May 3, 1937. Hugo Eckener was not on board. He had been grounded by the Nazi regime, which had grown tired of his private criticisms. The man who knew more about the Hindenburg than anyone alive would watch what happened next from the ground. The Hindenburg left Frankfurt at 7:16 in the evening of May 3rd, carrying 36 passengers and 61 crew members and trainees. The passenger list was a cross-section of the transatlantic world of 1937. German businessmen returning from New York meetings, American tourists who had decided that a Zeppelin crossing was worth the $450 ticket price, a traveling acrobat named Joseph Spey, who had spent the voyage making repeated trips to the cargo hold to check on his dog, and a family named Dorner, father, mother, and 3 children, returning from a business trip to Mexico. The youngest surviving child, Werner, was 8 years old. The Atlantic crossing was smooth but slow. Headwinds pushed against the ship across the entire northern route. past the southern tip of Greenland, across Newfoundland, down the New England coast. The scheduled arrival at Lakehurst Naval Air Station had been set for 6 in the morning of May 6th. By noon, it was clear the ship would be 12 hours late. By 3 in the afternoon, the Hindenburg was flying over the skyscrapers of Manhattan, and crowds on the street below looked up at something that seemed almost impossible. A silver shape the length of 3 city blocks drifting through the sky at rooftop height. In New Jersey, the weather was deteriorating. Thunderstorms had been moving through the Lakehurst area all day, and ground crews at the Naval Air Station were watching the sky with growing concern. Captain Max Pruss, commanding the Hindenburg on this crossing, had been a Zeppelin officer for 20 years. He knew bad weather, and he knew his ship. He requested permission to delay the landing and spent several hours flying the Hindenburg in slow circles over the New Jersey shore, waiting for conditions to improve. At 7 o'clock in the evening, ground conditions seemed acceptable enough. Pruss brought the ship in toward the mooring mast. The approach was complicated by shifting winds, and at a critical moment, Pruss executed a sharp S-shaped turn to align the ship with a landing field. It was the kind of maneuver experienced Zeppelin officers made regularly. It was also the kind of maneuver that put significant lateral stress on the aft section of the airship, specifically on the bracing wires that held the rear gas cells in position. What happened in the next few minutes is the subject of every investigation conducted since 1937, and no investigation has produced a definitive answer. What is known is this: at some point during or after the sharp S turn, hydrogen began leaking from the rear of the ship. The most widely accepted theory, supported by both the original 1937 investigations and decades of subsequent research, is that a bracing wire snapped under the stress of the turn, punctured one of the aft gas cells, and created a hydrogen leak directly above an electrically charged atmosphere. The thunderstorms that had been moving through Lakehurst all day had left the air above the landing field saturated with static electricity. The Hindenburg's metal frame was about to be grounded by its landing lines, creating exactly the conditions for an electrostatic discharge. At 7:25 p.m., Herbert Morrison pressed his microphone to his lips and began describing the great silver ship settling toward its mooring mast. He said it was one of the most beautiful sights he had ever seen. He said it was majestic. He was still speaking when the first flash of fire appeared above the tail. The fire started small. Several witnesses on the ground reported seeing a pale blue flicker near the top of the tail section, the color of static electricity discharging against hydrogen gas. Some described hearing a dull pop. Then the tail section lit up, and everything that happened next happened in 32 seconds. The Hindenburg's hydrogen did not explode. It burned. The distinction matters because it explains why 62 of the 97 people on board survived. An explosion would have killed everyone instantly. Instead, the hydrogen burned upward, a rising wall of fire that moved toward the nose of the ship as the gas cells ruptured one after another. The tail dropped toward the ground first, and as it did, some crew members and passengers who were near the rear of the ship, or who had the presence of mind to jump from windows and doorways before the nose came down, had a window of seconds in which survival was possible. Herbert Morrison's voice broke on the recording at the moment the fire appeared. He tried to continue his broadcast. He managed several more sentences before his composure failed completely, and the words that came out of him, words he had not prepared, words he would repeat for every interview he gave for the rest of his life, became the most famous sentence in the history of broadcast journalism. Oh, the humanity. The Hindenburg's nose rose into the air as the tail burned, then came down in a slow arc and hit the ground. The entire collapse from first flame to total destruction took 32 seconds. When it was over, the Hindenburg was a skeletal frame of duralumin girders lying on the grass of Lakehurst Naval Air Station, still burning. 13 passengers were dead. 22 crew members were dead. 1 member of the ground crew was dead. 36 people in total. Among the dead was Hermann Döhner, the family's father. His wife Matilda had thrown her 2 younger sons through an open window before jumping herself, breaking both her ankles on landing. Werner, the 8-year-old, landed in sand and survived. His older brother Heinrich did not. Werner Dohner would live with what he had seen for the next 82 years, carrying the last living memory of the Hindenburg disaster until his death in Laconia, New Hampshire, in November of 2019, the last surviving passenger. The fire was still burning when the first theories about its cause began circulating. And the theory that the Nazi government reached for, before any investigation had been conducted, before any evidence had been examined, would reveal exactly what the Third Reich was and what it was willing to do with 36 deaths. Within days of the disaster, Nazi officials began suggesting publicly that the Hindenburg had been the victim of sabotage. The name they circulated, without evidence, without any investigative basis, was Josef Spah, the acrobat who had made repeated visits to the cargo hold to check on his dog. Spah was Jewish. The Nazi theory required no further elaboration. The FBI investigated Spah thoroughly and found no evidence whatsoever connecting him to any sabotage plot. Neither the German nor the American official investigation endorsed sabotage as a cause. The German Commission's report, signed by Hugo Eckener himself and appointed by Göring's Air Ministry, listed multiple possible causes and admitted that no definitive conclusion could be reached. What Eckener said privately was different. In conversations with people he trusted, he indicated that he believed the most likely cause was a structural failure during the sharp S-turn approach. A snapped wire, a ruptured gas cell, a static spark in a storm-charged atmosphere. In other words, not sabotage, not conspiracy, not any external act of malice, but a consequence of flying a hydrogen airship in a thunderstorm after a maneuver that put excessive stress on an already aged airframe. A consequence, in short, of the decisions that had been made over 15 years about what gas to use and how to use it. After the disaster, American public opinion shifted. Majority support emerged for selling helium to Germany for the next great Zeppelin, the LZ-130. Congress amended the Helium Control Act to allow export for non-military use. Hugo Eckener traveled to Washington again and again, received agreement in principle. Helium would be sold. The LZ-130 would be safe. Then Germany annexed Austria in March of 1938. Secretary of the Interior Harold Ickes, the same official who would have signed the helium contract, refused to do so. He had not opposed the sale on political grounds when it was first proposed. But he was not willing to hand a strategic resource to a government that was actively expanding its military reach across Europe. The LZ-130 was completed and flew on hydrogen, but it never carried a single commercial passenger. It was eventually dismantled for scrap metal to support the German war effort. The age of the passenger airship ended not in the fire at Lakehurst, but in the moment Harold Ickes put down his pen. Hugo Eckener lived until 1954. He spent the last 17 years of his life writing, giving interviews, and declining to say publicly what he believed privately about what had caused the Hindenburg disaster and who bore responsibility for it. He had spent a career building the most extraordinary civilian aircraft in history. He had tried to make it safe. He had been overruled by cost, by politics, by the government of Adolf Hitler, and by the commercial mathematics of an industry that decided the appearance of safety was a sufficient substitute for safety itself. He died at 86, the most decorated airship commander who ever lived, and the man who had written the marketing copy calling hydrogen perfectly safe for passenger travel. The Hindenburg is remembered as a disaster. It was also, in a specific and measurable way, a turning point that no one planned for, because it burned in front of cameras and microphones, because Herbert Morrison's voice cracked on a recording that was played to the entire country the following morning, because the newsreel footage ran in cinemas from New York to Los Angeles before the wreckage had cooled. The passenger airship died instantly and completely, in a way that left no room for recovery or revision. The first commercial transatlantic passenger flights began in 1939. Within 20 years, airlines were carrying millions of people annually across oceans that had once required 5 days on a ship or 3 days on the most advanced airship in history. Every transatlantic route, every hub airport, Every set of international safety standards in aviation was built in the space the Hindenburg left behind. Werner Döner, 8 years old when his mother threw him through a window at Lakehurst, grew up to become an engineer in Mexico. He gave very few interviews about what he had seen. In the ones he gave, he said he did not remember the fire itself, only the falling, and then the sand, and then looking for his family in the smoke. He died on November 8, 2019, at the age of 90, in Laconia, New Hampshire. With him went the last living memory of what the Hindenburg looked like from the inside. The field at Lakehurst Naval Air Station is still there. A concrete circle marks where the mooring mast stood. There is a small plaque. Most people who visit are surprised by how ordinary it looks. Just a flat field in New Jersey. No monument, no eternal flame, no particular sign that anything happened there. The ground absorbed what fell on it, and the grass grew back the way it always does. 32 seconds. That is all it took to end an era, kill an industry, and open the sky to everything that came after.